All right,
Yeah.
go ahead. Somebody said something. Oh, okay. Well, the Bible talks about um, taking care of the sojourner, the stranger, the people who dwell among you temporarily or who are newcomers. Lots of scriptures about that, and that's one of when Jesus said, "You that you'll be blessed because you fed me, you gave me drink, and you visited me. You took care of me when I was a stranger." And they said, "Lord, when were you strangers? When did we see?" He says, "Whenever you are good to other strangers, you're doing it to me." So we have a responsibility as Christians to pay attention to the strangers, the newcomers, to take care of them, and to provide the things they need to be in to have a better life. Lisa Spiro is going to introduce our speaker today, who coincidentally is just going to talk about these very kinds of things. So, Lisa.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, I'm really happy that Jan Dijelop is joining us today. He's a Rice grad, also the chief strategist at Firestarter, the producer of several wonderful documentaries about the immigrant and refugee experience in Houston, including We Are In It, Seeds of All Things, and Lessons in Seeing. He also is the co-author of a Kinder Institute report called Refugee Realities Between National Challenges and Local Responsibilities in Houston, Texas. And he coordinates what I would call sort of a mutual aid network for local refugees. So Jan, take it away.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me okay? You can hear me? Cool. Great. I mean, thank you guys so much for having me, Lisa. It's really an honor. So I told Lisa this story a little bit. Like, Lisa told me a little while ago, "Oh, I would love for you to come speak," and I was so totally excited to do it. I love Lisa. I'm always inspired and chatting with her, and I was certain that her community would be a welcoming place. And then this week, in the middle of the week, I've been moving houses. I've got all sorts of crazy things happening, and I see a text from Jane Ann, one of my absolute favorite people on this planet, and she says, "Oh, you're speaking at my church this week." And I said, "Oh my gosh!" Like, you know, on 1 second, I thought, "Is that really this weekend?" And then I thought to myself, "This is great news," because based on the sample space of Jane Ann and Lisa, who are two of the most absolutely wonderful people that I've ever known, I'm certain that if that's a representation of this community, then what I can do is I can really just come, and I don't have to spend the time that I usually spend parsing things out and euphemizing and kind of making it something that is palatable. I can really just come and share a little bit about myself, be honest, be open, and you guys will accept that whatever my personal perspective is, as flawed as it is, I'm sure that you guys will hopefully challenge me at the end so we can have a conversation. But my plan is really just to share my personal experiences, and I'm very excited about it because I think that in the right spaces it can be personally cathartic and really powerful for everybody. So I'm absolutely honored to be here. Thank you guys so much for inviting me. I want to make sure that I have. Can I share my screen? Great. Let me just share this. Okie doke. You guys can see that as well?
You sure can.
So yeah, like I said, I'm just going to share a little bit about really my life and my experience and what I've seen over the last, I guess, 31 years of my life. And the last decade or so was really dedicated to studying, and particularly refugee resettlement, because I did come here as a refugee, and I'll tell you a little bit about kind of how that all came about. But there's really so much more that I think I had to delve into in order to understand what it really meant that I came as a refugee and that a lot of my friends came as a refugee, and what it means for us now. Over the course of that decade, the term refugee went from something that nobody really knew about, including somewhat myself, to something that became hyper politicized. And so I'm not going to use it. It's not particularly useful to talk about specifically refugees versus others. In some cases it is, and I'll show you some statistics at the end, because theoretically refugees should be the best. Theoretically refugees should have the best outcomes because, they're people that come here, are guaranteed citizenship, guaranteed status. We know where they are. We know exactly how to serve them. And yeah, so theoretically they should be the best representation of immigration to this country. But let me just get started. My slides are not going to be super helpful until the end. They're more just to make sure that I don't end up rambling on and on. And if I do, my wife is just in the other room, who you guys really should invite in the future, because she's absolutely brilliant. She's a domestic violence social worker and a dual language therapist and EMDR. And so we actually work together a lot in our work, and particularly working with the immigrant communities. She's the one that will teach you a lot. I hopefully will entertain you for about 20 to 30 minutes, but yeah, so she's gonna be my fact checker, and she's just in the other room. So these slides, so this is a picture of Elbrus, which is the tallest mountain peak in Europe. People think that it's Mont Blanc. See, she just corrected me, Mont Blanc. It's not, it's Elbrus. That's the highest peak in Europe. It's considered Europe, and it's not too far from my hometown of Nalchik, which you guys can see right here. So these are the Caucasus Mountains. If you guys, I don't know Black Sea, Caspian Sea geography, right around where I was born is the Caucasus Mountains, which in my mind means that I'm likely one of the few Caucasians, real Caucasians, that you guys have ever met, certainly on the call. And, something about my experience has been my personal kind of like tracing of how it is that my culture became appropriated by this term of Caucasian in the United States. And like even later on, Maggie and I both work with a lot of Afghan families, and it was always really funny that especially Maggie was a teacher in public school, and they have stats of who's, what races or ethnicities, or I don't even really know the difference between those terms, but there was always be Caucasian, and the bulk of those numbers I remember in her school were actually Afghans, because Afghan families had to post themselves as Caucasian. It's just a term that is so confusing to me. Where I come from, the Caucasus, in Russian we say Kavkazy, which just translates to Caucasian, and that's a very specific, unique community to that mountain range right there. And I think that term, which is used, ubiquitously here, is used usually as a term of erasure, to erase your own personal identity, to erase your status and replace it with something else that may or may not be real. My perspective is that it's not quite so real, but I'll get there. I'll get there, and hopefully you guys can help challenge me on that idea. But so I was born in the Caucasus Mountains of Russia. My mom was a doctor. She worked in a hospital that her father also worked at, and that was a really big part of my family's identity, was that there was a big line of doctors, which is why they're terribly saddened that neither my brother nor I became doctors here. At least my brother's a lawyer, so he's like a legit member of society. But so that's what my mom did, and a big strain of my family were all doctors. My dad was a physicist. He was not a nuclear physicist, which all my friends used to make fun of me for, just because he's Russian. I guess people thought that was probably what he was. He did something similar, actually. It was carbon, but he actually worked in Moscow. And so my family did live in Moscow, and they would go back and forth, but our kind of upbringings are in the Caucasus Mountains. As I grew up here in the United States, there was a really big question of, I remember there was a little film that they would show almost once a year, and I always thought that they showed it just so that the kids would stop making fun of me. I don't know if that's true or not. It's called Molly's Pilgrim. It's guaranteed to make me cry in about 5 minutes if we put it on. I think it's only like 15 minutes. It's a beautiful film. I think it's a book too. We have it. It's like a kid's book, and it's about this girl who comes to the United States, and she says that I'm a pilgrim, and the kids make fun of her because it's like Thanksgiving, and they say that's not a pilgrim, and she said, oh, but I am a pilgrim. And because she was this Russian Jewish girl that had very similar circumstances to me. And the idea was that she came here fleeing religious persecution. And that was very similar to, you know, the American pilgrims. And that was the theme of the film. And as a kid, that was always the answer that I gave when people would ask me. And I guess the kids would always ask me because they would show that film every year. They say, "Oh, Jan, why did you come?" And I would say it's because, you know, my family was persecuted in the Soviet Union, in Russia, for being Jewish, which, you know, is a much more complicated question. It's a much more complicated issue. And the answer to why did we leave is not one that I can give very easily at this point in my life. I try to simplify things as much as I can, but, you know, and I think that that's actually universally the case. It seems like when people ask an immigrant, why did you leave? They're waiting for one of two answers, and one of them is acceptable and the other one isn't. If you tell them, "Oh, I left because I wanted a better life, because I didn't have a job, because I needed economic opportunity," they say that's the wrong answer. You can't do that. Unacceptable. You know, I guess go into get out of line or something like that. And then the other one they want to hear is they want to hear, "Oh, I was going to be killed, right? I was fleeing. Someone was trying to kill me." And yeah, and the truth is that there's a spectrum. And particularly my wife, who works with a lot of unaccompanied minors who come from Central America, it's usually a little bit of both. For unaccompanied minors, I think it's far more dangerous than the circumstances that maybe my family came from, with a mother who was a doctor, a father who was a Moscow professor. We were probably a little bit more comfortable. I mean, very much more comfortable. But that spectrum of why did you come here, and that question in of itself, I think, is often used as a tool for violence. It doesn't have to be a tool for violence. It's usually, I think, something of an important story. But as an immigrant, you know, I think I was always forced to choose a very simple answer. And I think it's because people think that, oh, one is acceptable, the other is not. And they question, oh, were you really in this case or really in that case? At the end of the day, anybody who leaves their home, in some cases, has very, very similar circumstances. What is it that's going to make you leave everything that you knew? What is it that's going to make you leave the gravestones of your parents? What is it that's going to make you leave the security in the community? It's got to be something considerable, something big. It's not just going to be, oh, one day I woke up and I thought this might be a good idea. And at least for refugees and maybe a larger swath of the immigrant community that I know, there's usually been some conflict, armed conflict, economic conflict that the United States was involved in that led to us having to leave. The USSR, you know, the Cold War, it was an active battle between the United States and Russia, in which at the end, the United States convinced Yeltsin to give himself all the private or all the public property, and the whole system collapsed. That was probably, although there was a lot of violence actually around that time, a lot of my friends from Iraq, you know, they experienced the United States troops coming in with tanks and saying, we're here as liberators. In Afghanistan, something similar. A lot of the refugees that I know, they came because there was an armed conflict that usually had something to do with the United States. The Vietnamese refugees, you know, and that's not to say that you know, there's no value judgment on that. That's just usually what happens. But of course, there's differences. My friends who came from refugee camps in East Africa were in a very different situation than my family came. And I think that that's important to note. But I also just want to point out, you know, was there religious persecution in the Soviet Union? I'm not an expert. It's just my own personal view, my personal understanding. You know, so I come from the mountains of the Caucasus Mountains, and actually my family, they're what's known as mountain Jews. It's a different community. In Hebrew, they're called Harari. Har Sinai in Hebrew is Mount Sinai. And actually those people, the mountain Jews, they don't speak Hebrew. They speak a combination of Farsi and Hebrew. It's called Juhuri. It's kind of like Yiddish is a combination of Hebrew and German, or Ladino is a combination of Hebrew and Spanish, or Aramaic, right, was a combination of Hebrew and Babylonian. Is that right? Something like that. So it was a unique community. We looked very different than the European Jews that you would find in a lot of different parts of Russia. And actually, when the Nazis came, they occupied my town during World War II. They came to the community leader and said, okay, you guys gotta ship out. And he was able to convince them that, hey, actually, we're not Jewish. We self-identify as something called the Tat, which is pretty much a made-up term. There actually is a community called the Tats, but something totally different. And it was enough to get the German officer. This is a famous story because it had to do with, a lot of people know this story. The Germans sent back to Berlin to get some, I don't know, bureaucrat scientists to come and like whatever they did, measure heads or something like that, which unfortunately is a science form or a practice that I would argue is somewhat still being used today in a different emanation, I guess. And it delayed the Germans long enough to where the Soviet troops came back and the community there was spared. And later on, they continued using that identification to avoid being considered Jewish or to identify as something that was quasi-Jewish. And that's because in the Soviet Union, there was a very different type of cultural erasure, but it was ubiquitously accessible. And what I mean by that is, if you said, okay, I'm a member of the party, I believe in socialism or whatever, they didn't care what you looked like. They didn't care if you were Jewish. They didn't care if you were whatever. In fact, I later on worked in East Africa in a place called Somaliland, and I would meet people, Somalis, they're striking people. And a lot of my friends are like very, very dark skinned. But they spoke fluent Russian because when the Somali dictator was friends with the Russians and called himself a Soviet or socialist republic, they brought all the Somalis into the USSR and gave them education, became engineers and doctors and all that kind of stuff. So the form of it wasn't oppression because there was an erasure of cultures in the Soviet Union. But if you said, hey, I am a member of the party, if you self-identified as something, you had no problems. And in fact, I think that my parents did do that to a degree. My mother says that she never hid that she was Jewish. And there was a lot of places in the country where it just wouldn't be a problem. But I think that's also worth comparing, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when the move to bring the Soviet Jews began, you couldn't compare the levels of racism and violence that we could find in the United States to certain minority groups to what you could find in the USSR. There was nothing of the sort. There was way more violence in the US towards minority communities, and including Jews, I would argue, is my perspective, than in the USSR. So I guess I say all that just to make it clear that this is a more complicated circumstance, and who is decided to be a refugee and who is we say, okay, you're in the line, and who is not in the line, welcome to my cat here, is a much more complicated story and is not always reflective of the reality on the ground, the reality of how much people are in fact in need. And also, I guess, the most important thing here to note is that everybody's journey is very sensitive and very complicated. And this question of why did you come, I feel super comfortable with you all, again, knowing that small sample space of Lisa and Jane Ann, that you guys can honor what I share and take it with a grain of salt. But it's a complicated question, and if the answer to that question depends on, or decides whether somebody is permitted or whether somebody is acceptable, whether somebody is a good immigrant or a bad, that's something of a problem. So we came here to Houston, Texas. We didn't know anybody at all. I moved in. Actually, I think that was like my apartment. I tried Google Earthing it. It's called Brickhaven now. It's on Fondren and Braeswood. Coincidentally, my wife and I just recently bought a house not very far from here, which is nice to be somewhat back in the neighborhood that I was resettled in. So you know, there was really there was two main priorities that my family had when they came here. For my mom, she had to become a doctor again. She actually promised her father, who passed just before we left Russia, and who was actually pretty against us leaving. When he was dying, he decided, okay, you guys can go, but you have to promise me that Rena, who's my mom, that you'll become a doctor once again, and you won't throw away all that you have accomplished here in your life. And so she promised that she would. And so for her, the most important thing was to pass these USMLE exams and to become a doctor again. For my dad, he obviously, he was a high-ranking academic and scientist in Russia. And so for him, it was to somewhat reclaim his professional dignity and to provide for the family. Not easy tasks. They also had to learn English. They had to figure out where in the world they were. So there was a lot, but I think thinking about my mom's challenge, I think that there were two main factors that made it possible. The first was actually her friends. She met a group of friends who were also Russian. I think most of them were Jewish, but not all, who were in the same boat. They were trying to become doctors once again. They were trying to study for these exams. They didn't speak the language of the exam. And so and remember, this was 1992, 1993. There was no Google, like they had to go from library to library and, learn the library system. And we actually, she would go to Rice with her friends a lot, which is where my brother and I would run around the library there and scream and yell and play. And I don't think anybody ever told us to stop, which was quite nice. We always had a good time running around there. But that was their challenge. There was a group of people who was trying to learn this exam so that they could pass it. That was one. There was a community. It was really pivotal. The second, though, is a group called the Hebrew Free Loan Association. And the Hebrew Free Loan Association gave my mother a loan for $3,000, which in 1990, I don't know when she actually took those courses or when she took the loan, it was probably 94, 93, 95, I don't know. That was a lot of money, $3,000, especially for us. We were definitely living paycheck to paycheck. There was not even close to $3,000 in anybody's bank account. And so that is a free loan program that every single Jewish community across the world actually has. One of our Jewish teachers, Maimonides, he gave a ranking of charity and what kind of charity is most good to, the still charity, but I think the lowest form of charity is putting, 50 cents in a charity or just giving money to an organization or something. For him is the start, and then it goes all the way up. And the very top of Jewish values of what's the most charitable thing to do is actually to give an interest-free loan. And so that's something you'll find in every single Jewish community. Is pretty much a Hebrew Free Loan Association, and they'll give free loans to members of the community. It's a pay it back whenever you can kind of thing. And it's a complete game changer. I mean, my mom, she didn't know what was on the exam. She didn't know particularly English. And so to take some course, it was like a Kaplan course in that subject was critical for her to understand, to be able to pass the exam. And it took her, I don't remember exactly how long it took her. I know that there were several times that, I remember once that we would wait for the mailman. After she took the exam, we would wait a week, and then every day we'd go out and we'd wait for the mailman. The mail was somewhere behind this building. And that poor mailman, I think he was like extremely confused, because when we finally got the mail that said she had passed, my dad gave him a giant bottle of vodka, I remember. And I think she passed. She had to do 2 or 3 exams. And we would always go out and give him presents whenever we had the fortune of passing. Fortunately, I remember once she didn't pass by like 1 point. I think you have to get like a 75. She got a 74. It was devastating. But when she did pass, this wonderful mailman got presents from a family that didn't really speak English. And I think he was probably pretty confused as to what was going on. But, so I think it took her about 6 or 7 years to pass the exam. In the meanwhile, my dad's job was keeping us from bothering her. I mean, she obviously worked also. She worked as an interpreter. I think she had 2 or 3 jobs. But he had to keep us from bothering her, and he had to work. You know, he was the primary earner for our family. But there was some things that made that much easier. My brother and I were we went to private Jewish school for free. They didn't charge us. And we went to the Jewish Community Center, had an aftercare program. They didn't charge us. They said, pay us whenever you can, whatever you can. And of course, I think we started paying for school in like 2nd or 3rd grade, but I got pre-K, kindergarten, 1st grade for free without any questions. I mean, I don't think I have to tell you guys how important it is to go to pre-K and kindergarten. Not everybody has that opportunity, unfortunately, at least in this state. That's not a guaranteed. But, and the after school care was really, really important as well, because my dad, nobody could pick us up at 3:30. It's not going to happen. Like, they have to work. So actually the bus would ship us to the JCC, and we'd run around there like madmen until 5 or 6 or whatever. So that was critical. I mean, I don't know what they would have done without that. My dad had to leave work at 3:30. He couldn't have done done what he did. And I think the last piece is, of course, the community. I mean, I'm still actually the chairman of the board of Firestarter is one of my dad's first friends that he met through the Jewish community here, who also gave us our first car, who told us which grocery store to go to. And, the social ties that are created in the beginning of this Jersey are complicated. There was times when things were very, very awkward for my parents between them and people that tried to help them. And some of that is understandable, because the truth is that immigrants can be quite weird. I mean, especially there was an incident once where in Russia, we would have New Year's Eve is pretty much Christmas. You have a New Year's tree, and there's a guy called Uncle Winter who goes around and gives presents. It's non-religious in the Soviet Union because they tried to erase religious culture. So they made it a communist, or like a Russian holiday of New Year's. And so we had a New Year's tree, and Uncle Winter had given us presents. And then our members of the community who were helping us resettle came to our apartment, and we're like, wait, what's going on here? We thought that we brought you here because you were Jewish, and you guys are. So there's these awkward moments, but not every volunteer or mentor was able to help, and some that were not quite planned. But there was a community, there was a community that was ready and that was interested and involved, and I think that was critical. So I'm gonna do my own erasure of I don't know how many years. So I think we moved out of this apartment in like 1999. We moved to Pearland, where my parents were able to buy a house, which is very common. I think people go to the suburbs. It's just affordable. But let's just say that my parents did it. Okay, they were able to do it. My brother went to Rice. I went to Rice. There was a lot more to it. Obviously, it was not an easy shot by any chance, and there was a lot of difficult things along the way, but that's my childhood summary of what it took for them to help us, at least give us a fair chance, right? I don't know the final outcome of our lives, but we made it. And actually, so I was a student at Rice University. And although, I was thinking, Lisa, how much I hate to say it, but I do miss being back at Rice and going to Brockstein and having coffee. I mean, hopefully when this whole pandemic is over, we can do that again. But at the time when I was a student at Rice, I was quite bored. I studied math and economics, and I was like really trying to get out of there as much as I possibly could. So I started a nonprofit that did. We taught social justice education through organic gardening to kids across the country. So that was something that I involved myself in, so I didn't have to do schoolwork. And then I also started boxing and kickboxing and doing mixed martial arts. Those were actually two of my coaches up there. That was about 10th grade, so that was 2009. Another good excuse to leave campus and do something interesting. And I became very good friends with my kickboxing coach. Guled Ahmed, okay? And we called him G. And it was my senior year. So from sophomore year to senior year, I mean, I trained with him at least 4 times a week. We were very close. I knew that he was Somali. I didn't know that he was actually a musician. So, you know, because I don't know, he kind of kept that a secret from people. And then somebody told me, oh, Jan, did you know that G has a YouTube channel? And I said, what do you mean? Like G? And he's like, yeah, Guled Ahmed, Google him. And then I looked, and he has all these, he's a pretty famous musician. In fact, when I was in Somaliland, I was like, I told a little kid, I remember, hey, I know Guled Ahmed, he's my friend. And he started doing this little dance that Guled does in one of his music videos. And so he's famous. And so I decided I was going to make fun of him for it. So I put on his music during one of our training sessions. Somali music is actually beautiful. It's very, it's like very family oriented, very like, it's good stuff. And yeah, I mean, he doesn't look like that when he's kickboxing. And so I was making fun of him, and we started talking, and he said, you know what, man, like what I really want to do is I want to play a concert back in the refugee camp where I came from. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? Like, you know, he's like, yeah, you know, I was in a refugee camp, Dadaab, which at the time was actually the largest refugee camp in the world. I think it was something like 800,000 people were there. And they recently, I think they split it up into multiple camps. It was in Kenya, or it is in Kenya. It's still there. He lost his sister there, who passed away. You know, he had a family, you know, his family fled violence in Somalia. And so they were in a camp for a long time. And he said the word refugee. He's like, you know, like we were refugees. And I mean, I really, between this and this, I probably hadn't thought about refugees. I probably hadn't thought of that term. Nobody walks around saying, oh, I'm a refugee. And I thought, you know, in the back of my head, I said, oh, that's actually crazy. Like, I think actually I'm a refugee also. Such a funny thing. I was like, so when did you come here? He's like, oh, I came in 1992. I was like, no way, so did I. I was like, where were you resettled? And he was like, oh, well, it's a place called Brickhaven now, but it was called like St. Charles then. I was like, dude, gee, you're absolutely kidding me. Like, that's exactly where I lived when I first moved here. And he's like, yeah, like that's my whole thing. And so G and I became very close friends. I mean, we were always close friends. We did try to, he hasn't performed in the refugee camp yet, but I do hope that we can do that. But, you know, he was just some guy and I was just some kid. And I was doing all sorts of weird things on the side, mostly so I didn't have to pay attention to my studies at Rice. And I was working with some guys, and we started a nonprofit, actually, that used to be called Dharma Charitable Strategies. It's now called Firestarter. And we were trying to help him raise money for his thing. And he's like, oh, you know what? There's a community center that I have a friend, Abdi, and he runs a community center, and we can use his nonprofit to fundraise. So that's how I met Abdi, and that's how I learned about the Multi-Ethnic Community Center, which that's a picture there, but I won't jump yet. So the Multi-Ethnic Community Center was in Southwest Houston on Bissonnette, close to Beltway 8, and it was a conglomeration of Congolese, Sudanese, Somali, Albanian at one point before a lot of the Albanian refugees went back, sometimes Iraqi, and sometimes other groups, depending on which grant they were applying for. But the idea was that it was a multi-ethnic community center for refugees. And, you know, he first said, Jan, we would love your help making a website. And over my years, I've learned that when somebody says, I love help making a website, it means, can you make a website and then figure out everything that goes on it, because we don't really know what we do. So I also started working with their finances. I was just trying to delve in. And we were trying to organize all these things to try and get the community working, because by that point I had realized, like, oh my gosh, like there's something very different happening in this refugee community compared to my refugee community. And we tried everything. I mean, we really tried a lot. We put on community events. Of course, their website looked pretty decent back then. But you know, it wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen. I kind of over time, I realized why it wasn't going to happen. I don't know if this thing is in the way. Maybe you guys can see it. This was the building. I think their rent was like $6,000 a month. The rent was $6,000 a month. how is a nonprofit run by volunteers supposed to pay $6,000 a month for rent? Well, they had a grant called the Ethnic Community Self-Help Grant. That's exactly what it sounds like. Ethnic Community Self-Help Grant. It's from the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And it's because the Office of Refugee Resettlement understands that in order for a refugee community to be resettled properly, there needs to be community help. You know, you need to get support from your own community. And right now, I think it's a $4 million grant. $4 million are sent across the country to do what we know needs to be done to support refugees. You may be shocked to know it's not enough. You know, this is a sketch that I use in Firestarter often, and it's really beating the dead horse of something we probably know, which is grants are not going to solve anything in this world. The grant process will never solve anything meaningful in this world. As much as I love, and I have very good friends at the United Way, there's just no way. And so we were down here. We were trying to catch these little dollar bills, and there just wasn't enough. And so I was, you know, my question was always like, why was it that my community was resettled well? I had heard that, especially in Houston, the Vietnamese community was resettled well as well. And, you know, I mean, we know there's you can see it on the streets, you know, there was some successful effort to get us here. And why was it that there was no money, there was no, you know, there was nothing at all to help the new group of refugees that were coming in. And the problem is, you know, it doesn't take a genius to look at the difference between Guled and to look at me and to come up with a couple of differences. Okay. He's a Black Muslim coming from Somalia. I was a Jewish Caucasian coming from the Caucasus. There were some big differences in demographic shifts in the 90s and 2000s, and already by the 10s or whatever you call them, when I started working with the community. And what it was that a lot of groups were coming from around the world, Iraqi, Afghani, you know, still Somali and Bhutanese, but they were coming in smaller numbers individually. So whereas before everybody coming was Vietnamese or everybody was former Soviet, Jewish, they were coming in smaller numbers. So that was already a problem. There isn't an established Somali community here to help do so many of the things that were so critical for me and my family. But the truth is that a lot of that was done purposefully. And that's the story that I had to learn and I had to uncover over years and years of research. It took me about 10 years to do the research, and we finally published a report in the Kinder Institute. And I don't know, I think it's probably more formal version of what I'm just telling you guys today. But the history is that starting in 1980, to the present, they slowly cut down all assistance to refugees, right? Not only that, they made it illegal for a refugee to be going to school. If they weren't looking for a job, they weren't going to get assistance. What happened it was a transition from resettlement to rapid employment, right? And it's not a coincidence that the refugees coming now look very different from the refugees that were coming when my family came. And what's important for me to share here is the history of this absurdity. And there's a lot of stuff on here, but I'll share. I want to get to the real absurdity of what was going on here, because you can trace a straight line from ideology in the United States, which said, Black slaves have to be dependent on us. They have to be dependent on us because racially we're superior, and they won't live properly without us. That was an argument. However many, I don't know, not that long ago, people were probably still saying that. But definitely when the argument was about slavery, that was the argument. They have to be dependent on us. That's the way it has to be. That was one. Then there was an iteration once slavery was abolished, and this really got revamped in the 1960s, which was that, okay, if we're going to desegregate, and the rest of us who self-identify as Caucasian, right? We have access to public services, and that's okay. But if we're all of a sudden going to allow communities which don't have the ability to self-identify as Caucasian because of how we have defined those boundaries, if we're going to allow them into the fray, if we're going to allow them access to public services, then that's going to be a problem, because we still believe that they will always be dependent. There's a belief that, oh, the poor are just poor because they're dependent, right? Minority communities, if we help them too much, will remain dependent on us. And of course, they wanted them to be dependent maybe 50, 100 years back to the 60s, where you can trace a lot of this pseudoscience in the 60s, very similar to the scientists who were coming to measure the head size in my mountain Jews in Russia, right? There was this notion that the poor and minorities will be dependent. They're just naturally inclined to be that way, and we can't support that. We have to do something about it. And so they presented this idea that, oh, poor communities will be dependent on us if we help them too much. And what they did was, you can see in here, this chart, and actually now it's way less than 12 months, but this was the slow degradation. It went from 3 years of assistance. So you came from a refugee camp, we gave you 3 years, we paid your rent pretty much, to less than 12 months. And what they did was, every year from the very beginning, in 1980, the Refugee Act was actually a Jimmy Carter proposal, or passed through Carter. And then of course, the Reagan administration took over, and it wasn't, I really want to make sure that this is clear, it wasn't just one side or another. There was a lot of people who said, okay, if we're going to let them in, we have to solve this problem of dependency, which they had in their head of, oh, these people will be dependent. They're not going to want to work. They're not going to want to whatever. And so what they did was they started measuring dependency. They said, I'm going to measure something that I already assume is there. And actually, by measuring it, what you can see in what's called figure 4 here, effects of eligibility reduction. So in 1985, right, they reduced the amount of assistance that they were going to give to a shorter period of time. And so what that meant was that, since they were looking at a shorter period, the people within that period were more likely to be using social services. And they created their own, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. So every time they reduced assistance, the dependency rate would go up. Okay, I mean, that's the simple explanation of it. And so they wanted to see something there. They asked that question that they thought was already there, and they were able to find it in their own convoluted pseudoscience. Meanwhile, the reality of immigration, period, if you look at the bottom left chart, was that by 1988, half of the budget of ORR was already being paid for by only the South Asian refugees. So these are people that came from Vietnam, right? Just that community was already paying in their tax contributions almost the entire budget of ORR. So this is the reality, right? The reality is that it's nonsense to think that an investment in my family didn't pay off, right? It's nonsense to think that investment in any immigrant family doesn't pay off, right? It's nonsense to think that an investment in the poor, no matter where they come from or where they are, isn't going to pay off. It's nonsense to think that investment in anybody that says, hey, I need a little bit of help, is going to hurt us in the long run, financially, right? We as good people know that it helps us in so many more ways than financial. But these arguments were crafted in some kind of nonsensical financial, economic jargon, pseudoscience, I would call it, and people bought it. And the consequences were awful. The consequences were that the communities couldn't function. In fact, the consequences were, if you look at the bottom right table, that in the 90s, which used a larger period of support, at the end of 5 years, 10% of people did not speak English. And the percentage of people originally who didn't speak English was quite high, 64. In the 2000s, so after this rapid employment mantra came into place, you had more people who didn't speak English after 5 years than before, even though they started off speaking more English. And there's a million stats I can throw at you. But it took me 10 years to go through and unravel this convoluted puzzle. And the academic term for this argument, which a lot of people bought. I mean, it wasn't just one political party, right? It was nonsense that people took for decades, and still today you hear this reciprocated in some way. People who have reasonable perspectives are caught in this argument, and it's because of the academic principle, which is called bullshit, right? And that's here. I was right? The bullshit asymmetry principle, right? To propose something which is totally meaningless and convoluted and whatever is so much easier than the energy it takes for us to counter it and to make it clear that that's just a bunch of nonsense. I mean, it took me 10 years. I was a refugee. I should have known something about what was going on. And none of my friends could really get through to figure out why was it that things were as messed up as they were. And this is really what it comes down to, is that if somebody proposes something completely nonsensical and we're gonna sit around trying to placate them and figure out, well, does this make sense? Does it not make sense? We're not gonna have time to do anything else in our lives. And so, I hope I didn't ramble for too much, but the idea, for us at this point, and Lisa, has seen it from the very beginning, and I think she can speak to it. We can't wait. I don't have a horse in the political race. I don't. I mean, the reality is that this process was overseen by all of America. Again, we all allowed this to happen. And the question is, what do we do now? Look, I'm going to vote for whoever I think is making the most sense. But I know that this is a very challenging thing to refute. And so what we do is we gather ourselves. It's not a nonprofit. I love what you call it, Lisa, a mutual aid organization. It was really important that we didn't do this work under the auspices of a nonprofit, because I think that those systems really can be quite destructive for progress. It's just a group. We meet once a month. We manage a small pool of funds. You see that we started with a little bit more of experimental funds. But now it's getting close to $40,000 that we've given out to just different members of the community, and they'll pay it back when they can. And you won't find a donation button on any website on the internet that can give money to this. That's if we're spending time running a nonprofit and raising money and raising awareness and playing into this game, we just won't have time to do the important work, which is just sitting down together, being with one another, and just being human beings, doing what, thank God, we were made to do, which is extend our kindness and compassion to one another, and to just live our lives. And so that's what it took us to figure out kind of why we were doing what we're doing, is that we have to do it ourselves. And, God willing, we'll get some help along the way. We always do. I'm not sure if it'll ever come from political channels, but we don't need to wait. We don't need to wait for that. So I hope I didn't go too long. I hope I can answer some questions, and I hope we can have a conversation if it's not.
Well, we really don't have the time for this, Johan, but thank you so much. We will you can send us the link, or I'm sure I can find the link from the Kinder,
of course,
for the Kinder report. That would be helpful. But you're telling us some really good stories here. I mean that in the very positive sense. I like good stories, and it's good to hear from you. And it's really the last thing that you're talking about, these mutual things. There's a friend of mine whose name I can't come up with right now, but she wrote a book called The Immigrant Advantage, and talks about a number of the various ways that people have different groups have sharing money, loaning it out like that, and that sort of thing. And I'm going to put that on the list of resources as well. But thank you so much for. Lisa, did you have anything you'd like to say?
No, I mean, I wonder if we could take like just a few minutes for questions.
I think if we can get about 5 minutes worth.
And all I have to say is, wow, thank you, Jan. That was really tremendous.
I can answer some of these quick things in the chat. No, I mean, thank you guys. how is phrenology being used today? I mean, I don't understand anything about what a Caucasian is. I don't know what white means. I think that we all choose to self-identify as what we want to self-identify. And if you're not proud of who you are, then you're not that. I mean, you know, like there's a very small group of people walking around saying I'm white pride, right? I don't think that that term means what people think it means. And we are, that's a term of erasure. That's a term to tell you that you're not somebody, you're white, or I mean, it's just not real. And so if you can't say that I'm proud of it, then you're not that thing. Whoever you are, you should be proud of it. And so I think that phrenology is very, you know, I think we've actually bought into this idea of whiteness or Caucasian or whatever. It obviously gives a lot of us guilt for just not, you know, what should we be guilty about? We should be proud of who we are. We should be proud of where we come from. And so if you self-identify as white, you can tell me you're proud of it. That's great. But I think that probably we're all a lot more. I think that we all have a rich, colorful history. And so that's what I mean by it still being used today. The Olive Foundation, I haven't heard of the Olive Foundation, but what's crazy is HIAS, which is the Hebrew International Aid Society. There was a moment that I was going through the multi-ethnic community center's finances, and I saw that they were paying for my Somali friends to do some small program. And that was such a crazy moment for me. HIAS is what brought me and my family here. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess I'll also answer, you know, I benefited greater for the Jewish community. I mean, the answer, unfortunately, and I have to be honest about this, my community, when we finished resettling refugees, I got the folder of my family's case, which was really, really funny to read what their interpretations were of my father and his stubbornness and all that kind of stuff. But they still have those files, but they stopped doing refugee resettlement. It was the Jewish Family Services, which is a wonderful social service agency. I know my wife works with them as well. They work with non-Jews. They used to resettle, and they said in 2003 that we're shutting the doors. First of all, because we resettled as many Jews as we could, but also because they knew that financially by 2003, people were being brought here and they weren't given enough to survive. The amount of money, the amount of support that people are getting, it wasn't being done in an ethical way. And so they said, we're not going to do it if we can't do it ethically. And so what happens is we resettled our own community, and then we kind of closed the door behind us. And I think that's a challenging thing that my community has to discuss. And so my fear is that the answer is that there isn't that kind of support. In fact, there's a lot of fighting. It's a lot of fighting between small ethnic groups right now, and even within small ethnic groups. And a lot of that has to do with the agencies, because the first person you meet a lot of times speaks your language, but he works for an agency which is committing violence upon you because of the way that the systems are made. So imagine that you're so happy to meet somebody that also is from Eritrea, and they tell you, here's $10, go get a job. Well, are you going to trust another Eritrean, you know, when you meet them on the streets? No. So I actually think that there's much deeper. The consequences of the system go very, very deep. Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm not sure who comes legally or illegally. Remember that anybody who comes here and claims asylum is here legally. And it's 100% legal to come to the border without an invitation and say, hey, please give me asylum. And if we don't have a system to deal with that, that's on us. And we've known about this for decades and decades. And if we haven't competently put together a system that can deal with that, then that's on us. So, you know, this idea of illegal immigration, I don't know, maybe we could talk about it if we had a real system to deal with immigrants. Kinder Institute doesn't talk about refugees. Refugees are, I mean, refugees are a tiny, tiny proportion of immigration. The budget for refugees is nothing, but you hear about it all the time. And that's something that that's purely racially motivated. I mean, why would people be talking about race? Refugees are a tiny portion. And it was, you know, it was very sad when I was actually in Somalia when I saw an article that said, oh, Texas senator wants to stop refugee resettlement to Texas. Well, that's, you know, that doesn't make any sense. And so, yeah, unfortunately, it's very hard to measure a lot of these things because it's hard to, yeah, I mean, once you're here, you're an American. How are we gonna, you know, nobody walks around with refugee written on their forehead. So I just went through these questions here. I don't know if I'm happy to take another. You guys have time.
Well, I'm sure people would really like to keep talking with you. It's our church service is recorded, but right after that, we have a live meeting that people want to go to after having gone through the church service. So the worship service.
Thank you guys so much.
Well, thank you. It's really, it's helpful, it's educational, it's inspiring to hear you talk about these things. I think all of us will think about them and with a little better sense of a number of things.
Of course, and I'll share my email. I would love to connect with you guys. I really am honored. And again, if you guys are anything close to Jane Ann and Lisa, I would love to get to know you a little
Well,
bit.
we are close to Jane Ann and Lisa.
Yeah.
And you're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. You can sign on to, you can visit our church
That's awesome.
by Zoom. When we open up, you're welcome to come. We're open to all.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very
Thanks a
much.
lot, Jan.
Bye-bye.